My name is Mark Leavenworth. I'm the IRM Education Outreach Coordinator here at DIR, and I'm really happy to introduce Marie Cohan, who is the Statewide Digital Accessibility Program Administrator, and who's going to be giving today's presentation. She's a colleague of mine here at DIR. Before I turn it over to her, I'd like to touch on a couple things. Today's session will be recorded. Slides will be available following the presentation, and an evaluation link is going to be shared in the chat and by email following the session. IRMs or anyone that needs an IRM CPE form for proof of attendance that will also be attached to the email. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Marie.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody.
Okay, how's that? Am I unmuted?
You're good.
Okay, having some technical difficulties. So we're going to talk a little bit today about digital accessibility, compliance, procurement, resources that DIR offers. I've also added digital accessibility maturity into the discussion and project management. Trying to see my buttons over here. Okay. So my name is Marie Cohan. Mark introduced me. I have been with DIR for about 10 years, a little over 10 years. I started out doing program management work in the CFO division, doing business process management, compliance and audit, some application development to automate processes, things like that. And then I moved over into our operations division as a IT project manager, managing large IT projects. And then I just recently started in this position this year in January, working with the disability or the accessibility community. And it's been a lot of fun, actually. I'm really enjoying this new role. A little bit about myself to describe myself. I am a female with long brown hair. It's curly. I'm wearing black glasses and I have a black dress on. So our learning objectives today, we're going to look at the importance of digital accessibility, kind of the why we do all of this work that we do, DIR's digital accessibility program, our laws, rules, and standards. We're going to talk about how to evaluate electronic and information resources procurements for accessibility, digital accessibility and project management, and digital accessibility maturity. So why is it important to focus on digital accessibility in IT? So with COVID, everybody pretty much went online. And even without COVID, our day-to-day lives are pretty much online. So everything we do has been digitized. There's some way to use a computer or smartphone to manage whatever it is that you need to manage in your life. When we don't design for everyone, so when we leave out people with disabilities, we're leaving out a fourth of the population. So it's really important to design for everyone so that people with disabilities can have access to education, they can work online, they can, purchase plane tickets or bus tickets, they can manage their own finances, manage their own health care. Without technology accommodating them, they would have to bring in someone else to support them. Which is difficult when you're talking about healthcare. Then they have access to private information, or when you're talking about banking and finance. So we want to give everyone the opportunity to live independently and have privacy and be able to access everything that they can access on the internet. So the ADA defines a disability as someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, and they have a recording of this impairment, or it can be perceived. So someone can notice that you may fall into a certain category and you're still eligible for accommodations. There are 4 disability categories. There's physical, there's developmental, behavioral, emotional, and sensory impairment. So like I said, 25%, 26% now, it's gone up a little bit. I anticipate that number is going to continue to go up as the baby boomers are kind of aging out. So right now we're at 26% of the adult population has some type of disability. In Texas alone, the age group over 75, makes up 54% of the disability population. So for developmental, I have these icons listed. I have someone in a wheelchair, I have a baby crawling, and a person using a cane to demonstrate for developmental. It can start at birth and go all the way up through later stage of life. I have a head showing a brain for behavioral emotional, and I have a hand to show for sensory. So I'm going to give you some examples and show you, the reason I mention the icons is because you can have co-occurring disabilities. So it doesn't have to be just one thing. It can be a multiple, you can fall into multiple categories. And also all of these categories are on a spectrum. So it's not just kind of a one size or you fall into, it's not very binary. So you could have low vision that's considered a legal disability all the way up to complete blindness. We have, different varieties of color blindness. Some people can't see blue, some people can't see red. So it just depends. So keep in mind that all of this is a spectrum. So who is our audience? So again, we're designing for everyone because we want to be inclusive. So smart, well-designed technology is a win for everyone, even able people. I like to mention here, to give you an example, we use a lot is called the curb cut effect. So in construction accessibility, we design curbs to have a ramp. So they're built into all of the corners at an intersection. You'll see ramps in buildings. And what that has done over the years is that no longer just accommodates someone in a wheelchair, it now accommodates people pushing a stroller or pushing a shopping cart or riding a bicycle and they need to get up on the sidewalk to get off of the street. So there are multiple uses for that particular accommodation. The same thing happens in digital accessibility. So one example in digital accessibility is talking to your phone Siri. So being able to do a voice interaction with your technology is a type of accessibility accommodation that's now become something that everyone uses. It benefits everyone. So here are some personas when we're looking at how does it benefit everyone. So this just demonstrates when we talk about those different types of disabilities, some of them are permanent, some are temporary, and we can have situational disability. So I'm going to use the example for vision. So if I'm blind, that's a permanent disability, no intervention, no medical care. It's not going to heal itself over time. So that would be a permanent disability. But if I go in and have surgery, let's say I have, cataract or something removed, and I've got a patch over my eye for a couple of weeks, that would be considered a temporary disability because over time it will improve, or with some medical intervention, it will improve. A situational disability with vision would be if I'm looking away from the windshield of my car. So if I'm not paying attention, I'm driving, I'm looking at my phone, I'm texting and driving, or I'm just distracted by something else in the car, that is considered a situational type disability, and then that could have an impact. So we have these different personas that will interact with technology. They may have permanent, they may be temporary, they may be situational. So when we're designing applications or when we're looking at our websites, we follow the POUR principles. So perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So perceivable is information that's accessible for different senses. Operable is input devices that can be used. So if I need to plug in a specialized mouse, or if I need to connect with a mouse tool that I use with my technology. Understandable is the interface and information is easy to understand. So that is really helpful for folks that have some cognitive issues. We want to write in a way that the most important information is stated in the sentence or in the paragraph early on, and try to remove filler words, try to remove prepositional phrases or passive voice, anything like that that can become confusing for the reader. And then robust works with a wide range of devices and assistive technologies. So think screen readers is a big one. So here are some examples when you're doing development work. For, let's say, most of you probably see project status updates or project management reports, and you have the red, yellow, green, or even in security, you have red, yellow, green color codes for different statuses. So if you don't design that field that shows the color to also have the word in there. So in this case, in progress is yellow, complete is green, and red is behind schedule. So if you don't actually code it in to that field where it reads out to the user that it's in progress versus it's a yellow field, they will not be able to understand. They will not be able to see. If I'm blind, I can't see those colors. If I am colorblind, I can't perceive those colors. They may be monochromatic shades of gray or blue or something else to me. So we want to add labels into our fields that can be read through a screen reader. At the bottom of my screen, you'll see a table with a date. So again, we want to add in, if we're doing data entry fields, we want to have fields that not only list, enter the month here, but we want to also embed it into the actual field so that when a screen reader scrolls over that field, it tells me that it's the month that needs to go in there. And also, how do I enter it? Is it a 2-digit number? Same thing with year. If I'm entering the year and that tells me I need to enter the year in that field, is it 2 digits or is it 4 digits? What is the format that it needs to be entered in? Same thing with phone numbers. So we want to add all of that into the coding of the field. And then when we talk about the understandable, again, we want to add, the big highlights, the newsworthy information at the beginning of the sentence or the paragraph, and then pepper in details if needed, and try to keep all of that extraneous information, find different ways to be more direct in your communication so that it's understandable by everyone. So assistive technology that you might have to purchase within your programs are screen readers, or also technology that our users, of the public, uses when they're accessing State of Texas websites, is screen readers, speech to text or voice to text applications. Closed captioning is a big one right now. We were trying right before you started, so I were a little flustered. We were trying to get the closed captioning to work for today's meeting, and we just couldn't get it to work. So that's something that it's an action that we'll have to take. Mouse pointers, specialized keyboards, and navigation tools. There's a lot of new mice that are coming out on the market that can be used by anyone, actually. And there's different styles. If I have just an arm, I don't have a hand, or I don't have fingers. They've now developed a lot of accessories that are very usable by everyone. Zooming, the ability to zoom in to, I think it's 200% zoom in to a screen. So if I can't read well, like normal text, I have a Zoom application or Zoom add-on to my computer to be able to see that the text, the content is able to accommodate that level of zoom. And then telephone devices. So DIR does have a statewide program, much like Mark. We do work a lot together. He works with all of the IRMs in the state of Texas. I work with all of what we call the ERACs, the Electronic and Information Resources Accessibility Coordinators. And we have a statewide program for both of those groups. So my program, which is around digital accessibility, my customers are state agencies and institutions of higher education, public institutions. I also work closely with our vendors to educate them, to make sure that they have the resources they need to properly respond to a solicitation. And then I work within the agency, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as I go through the presentation, about cultural adoption of accessibility within your organization. So for my role within DIR, I work with our DIR Accessibility Coordinator, or ERAC. I also work with our General Counsel. I work with our Governance, Risk, and Compliance Officer. I work closely with the IRM and the IT staff. Agency leadership is very supportive in DIR. Work a lot with our procurement team. And I'm hoping to work more with our project management group. I work with the policy group, and then also HR. So it is something that is peppered out throughout the agency, and it's very important to adopt it throughout the agency. So see, these are some of the things that the DIR program does for our customers. So again, state agencies, institutions of higher education. We have a learning management system that we pay for and we provide to our customers free of charge. We also have a web scanning program, which in the past we have provided free of charge. I'm hoping that that will continue going into the new fiscal year. We do, for a cooperative contract program, we do an initial accessibility procurement review, and I'll go into that process later on. We also have additional training opportunities. So we might have something like this, like a webinar that we host, or like DIR Connect conference. We had an accessibility section there. We have DIR Discover coming up in September. We're going to have an accessibility section there on the pre-conference day. The whole afternoon is going to be focused on accessibility. So we try to add those opportunities for our communities. I have my own ERAC community, so kind of like the IRM listserv, I have a listserv for the ERAC, and I host a monthly coffee chat. So we meet for about 45 minutes once a month, and we just either have a training opportunity. One month we talked solely about website development. This past one we had a couple weeks ago was focused on just questions from the community. So I collect those questions ahead of time, and then we go ahead and run through them during the meeting, and everyone gets a chance to weigh in. So it's really more collaborative for the community, peers supporting peers. And then we also provide compliance support. So DIR does make the rules that the agencies in higher ed have to follow, but we also want to make sure that everyone is successful in complying with those rules. So we do as much as we can to help our customers be successful. And then we also work with the vendors, like I said. So we have training that's designed just for the vendors, and then we provide guidance to the vendors through the solicitation process up to a certain point. So up to the point where they submit their solicitation, they have opportunities to ask questions, clarification, make sure that they have the right templates. All of that is fair up until they turn in their solicitation. And then DIR also does reporting. So the IRDR that goes out every 2 years, there's some questions on there that the IRMs complete regarding where they're at in their accessibility program and how they're complying with TAC. So our learning management system is called Access Academy. If you are familiar with this program, you would have heard in the past it was Access University. They have now developed a new platform. They just rolled it out a few months ago. It's really a nice platform. I think it's a lot more user-friendly. We seem to have a lot more customers getting engaged with it, which is great. If you would like to register any of your employees, they can email me at statewide-accessibility@dir.texas.gov. This is open to all state employees, so it does not have to be your ERAC or your IT staff. Anyone in the agency can sign up for an account and go attend the training. And the trainings are set up, they're role-based, they're time-based. You can do a search for a specific topic. You like type in Word and it'll pop up the classes for making accessible Word documents. So the platform is very user-friendly and it is nice. And so what I've done here, I've been cultivating classes and kind of categorizing them by function within an agency. And so I've added some classes here that would be helpful for your IT staff. So I've pulled those 4 classes out, and I can share this presentation later. And then I've also added classes that are just good for anyone in the organization. And then I do have some other ones that are specific to procurement or folks in your agency that maybe do the reporting and presentations, things like that. There is a separate group of classes that would help that group as well. So now we're going to talk about the fun stuff, the laws, the rules, and the standards. So the top tier of accessibility or digital accessibility laws comes from the federal government. So the Americans with Disabilities Act has the 4 different sections of it do touch on accessibility in general, accommodating people with disabilities. But then Section 508 has the specific terminology when it comes to digital accessibility. And then as far as enforcement goes, there really are no enforcement bodies except the Department of Justice. So they are the main enforcement body right now. State of Texas does not have an enforcement body. We pretty much rely on ourselves and the kind of the controls we have in place to make sure that we're compliant. If we're not compliant and we don't address the non-compliant issue, then there's a risk that someone in the public or an employee will take an action against the agency or the university. So that's another type of enforcement. For Texas, we have Texas Government Code 2054, and specifically subchapter M talks about electronic and information resources accessibility for the state of Texas. And then that law also gives DIR authority to create rules for the agencies. And so we have TAC 206 and TAC 213, and I'll go into more detail on both of those. And then we also follow some industry standards. We have the World Wide Web Consortium that it's a group of professionals and SMEs in the community, and they come up with the standards and the testing criteria, and they update that through the WCAG outline. And so right now, the state of Texas has adopted WCAG 2.0 AA, but the 2.0 has now moved to 2.1, and then 2.2 is in draft mode and going to be released later this year. And already I'm hearing discussion around 2.3. So I'm not sure when the state of Texas will adopt a new WCAG version. That question has come up quite a bit. What I do know is from conversations with the General Services Administration, they have basically said that any state or public entity can adopt a higher level of WCAG, but not below 2.0 AA. So that's the baseline is 2.0 AA. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, when it talks about protecting people's rights who have disabilities, Title I is related to employment. And again, that could, think about your electronic job postings that could fall into that category. State and local government and transportation, businesses, nonprofits, and public accommodations, and then telecommunications and relay services. And I was going to mention it because it was kind of interesting. It was an interesting little argument or loophole. Lyft is currently going through litigation because they do not provide wheelchair accessible vehicles. Those are vehicles that have maybe a wheelchair lift where they can actually lift the person into the vehicle. They have the technology to provide that. They just haven't turned it on, and they're refusing to turn it on. And they made a case about, limited access to those types of vehicles and how would they service certain areas. But the argument that Lyft is making is that they're not a transportation company. And so they're trying to skirt the law by saying they're not a transportation company. So I found that to be kind of interesting. Okay, so we're going to focus on section 508, which covers a lot of the information and communications technology. So the way it's set up, it has these 7 chapters, and WCAG guidelines tend to follow these chapters as well. Also, the core principles that I mentioned are, I'm finding that those are listed out in WCAG as well. So they kind of have these categories that follow each of those standards. So chapter 1 is around application administration. Chapter 2 has the scoping requirements. Chapter 3 is functional performance criteria, which is a big one. And then chapter 4 and 5 are hardware and software. And chapter 6 is supporting documentation and services. And then chapter 7 has different references. So I talked earlier about Texas Government Code, subchapter M. This is the statute in Texas that gives DIR authority to create rules that support our agencies in higher ed. It also lists out what the standards are for digital accessibility in Texas, or they call it electronic and information resources accessibility. And basically, the Texas statute pretty much aligns with the federal statute. There's not much difference. There might be some little nuances. But for the most part, they align with each other. So Texas Administrative Code 206 is focused on website accessibility. This is a very synthesized version of the TAC. There's my So just kind of give you a quick outline. It starts off with compliance with Section 508. So again, that alignment with federal law. It does clearly state in here that the baseline is WCAG 2.0 AA. It talks about closed captioning for videos and websites, or videos that are posted on websites. Alternatives for non-compliance. So even vendors, if you have an application that you're selling to the state and it does not fully meet compliance standards, or maybe there's a gap in one specific success criteria that's needed, they have to come up with an alternative way to accommodate the user. Accessibility testing, this is really important. We can't just rely on automated testing. So the TAC does state in there that manual testing is required as well. Automated testing only captures about 1/3 of errors, accessibility errors. And so we need to do the manual testing, and preferably we do testing with a person who has a disability. And you design those test scripts maybe to test for a couple of different disabilities to make sure that you're designing or hitting those different categories. Accessibility policies required, adaptability for browsers and devices, and then establish compliance goals and measurements. And again, I think we cover most of that with the IRDR survey questions. So this is a graphic from our recent IRDR. This is going to be part of the biennial performance report. So I went ahead and just pulled 2 of my graphics out of there. So this shows compliance with TAC, agency compliance with TAC with regard to their website. And 78% of the state is falling into the higher range, which is great. And we're seeing those numbers going up of increasing compliance within the agencies, and those websites getting closer to 100%. We'll never truly be 100%. There's always going to be, changes and something that needs to be updated for accessibility. But these numbers are really promising for us, and it's a good show for the state of Texas. So TAC 213 is focused on electronic information resources, so kind of like everything else aside from websites. And you can see it goes down through all of the different types of technology and, exception process, documentation that's required, assigning an accessibility coordinator that is required in TAC. I'm currently going through and auditing our ERAC list. We do keep track of all the ERACs for the state of Texas, and I'm finding that there's a lot of missing ERACs, or there are ERACs who are assigned by their agency, but they never submitted documentation to DIR. So you might be hearing from me, you might get an email from me saying, could you please fill out a form to make sure we have your ERAC on file? And I appreciate all of your help with that, because we want to get that current. So we're going to focus on procurement. That's the big one with regard to this TAC. That's the one that agencies are spending quite a bit of time on. And this is another graphic from the recent IRDR, and really what I want to highlight here, so these numbers are improving as well, but what I want to highlight here is the big one to me when I look at this is agencies are still struggling with training and skills with regard to digital accessibility. So again, we provide Access Academy. That is not the only place to get training, but it is a way to get training within your agency. Again, any conferences that we host at DIR or webinars like this, I encourage ERACs to join and participate to just help them learn as we go. We're all learning together, especially the ERAC community. They're so dedicated to this. There's a lot of passionate people in this community, and they really want to help each other. They really want everybody to kind of rise together as far as training and doing the right thing when it comes to digital accessibility. So industry standards, the Information Technology Industry Council is responsible for creating the VPAT. So you've probably heard that term in your procurement. It's a voluntary product accessibility template. It is just a template. It has the WCAG standards on there and success criteria. This is something that an application manufacturer or a product manufacturer would complete. It's not completed really by anyone else. It needs to be completed by whoever coded the application. And the vendor will test their product against those different success criteria, and then they'll put in how they conform to the different criteria. So do they support it, fully support it, minimally support it, or partially support it, or not support it at all? And that's what your ERACs and your procurement teams are looking at when you're procuring some sort of electronic and information resource product. Once the manufacturer completes the VPAT, it becomes an accessibility conformance report. And that is what we require vendors to submit on their procurement responses, is an ACR for every single product. So different versions of products are going to have different ACRs. You know, there's 1,000 probably Apple products or Dell products. Each one of those different products will have their own ACR. We have the World Wide Web Consortium. I mentioned again, that's a group of subject matter experts in the industry. They come together. They're the ones that come up with the new standards. They're currently working on draft 2.2 for WCAG. And then WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This is what products are tested against, what websites are tested against. They set the standards, they have the success criteria in there. And as we go through testing, we can see where it conforms to those different success criteria. Something I'll mention here, which is really important, and this comes up a lot too, there is no certification for accessibility. There is no like stamp that we can put on a product or a service and say it meets X criteria or it's at this level. There really is nothing like that in the industry right now. A lot of people are talking about how that would be so much easier to have something like that, but it does not currently exist. So testing is really the only certification, in air quotes, that gives you some assurance of where that product or service is. So it's how it was tested. Again, did they just do automated testing? Did they also do manual testing? What did those test scripts look like? What did they test for? What were some of the errors that were found? How did they remediate those errors? That's where you're going to really find that you can, make those determinations of how accessible is that product? Where does it fall in line with other products? So speaking of products, we'll talk now about procurement. So the graphic on your screen is DIR's current process with regard to my role. Or just the electronic and information resource review in general. So we have any EIR procurement that comes through is going to have what I call an accessibility packet attached to it. And then also we want to make sure that, the RFO language is stated correctly, it's comprehensive, that it has, safeguards in there for the agencies down the road. For example, let's say you're procuring a new website. We want to make sure that not only is the RFO written in a way that ensures you get an accessible website and it meets certain criteria and certain testing was done, but also what happens if there's remediation needed. So who's going to be responsible for that remediation? Is your vendor who designed your website going to go back in and correct any code that needs to be corrected that failed an independent test? Because you'll have testing with your vendor through the different iterations of the project lifecycle, but then you'll have some final testing on the back end before you go live. So we want to make sure that we understand who's going to be remediating those issues from that point on. So I review the RFX language with our procurement team, just make sure again that the statutes are correctly stated, the rules are correctly stated, that all references are correct, that the correct templates are attached, the most current versions are attached for our vendors, because we give them links to the VPAT, the most current VPAT, which by the way, there is a new version out. They're up to 2.4 now on that VPAT version. Our minimum is 2.3 that we accept. Make sure they have the most current version of the policy driven adoption for accessibility, self-assessment, and then our VATSR form that DIR uses as well for services. So once that is done, the solicitation will go out. and our vendors will have a chance to review it and start drafting their responses. And somewhere along the way, we'll have a pre-bid conference for the vendors, which is an opportunity for them to come in and ask questions about the procurement. We kind of go through the different sections of the procurement and the requirements, like hub requirements, security requirements, accessibility requirements. And we do document those questions and submit them in writing back to the vendors. So this is an opportunity for them to ask me questions. I do sit in on those pre-bid conferences. They can ask pretty much anything is fair as long as it's not giving them an advantage in the procurement. And then once the solicitations, that solicitation is closed, all the responses have been brought in and they've gone through their initial vetting. I get the accessibility packet for that solicitation, and I'll go through and review each of those for each vendor. And I have some different criteria I look for, which I'll cover with you next. And then I'll assign a score, a holistic pass-fail score for that particular accessibility packet, and then send that back over to our procurement group. So that's kind of my procurement process end to end. I do recommend that your ERACs have a similar process, or that they are similarly involved in procurements instead of just on the back end reviewing the documentation that came in. It is helpful to have them in on the front end and also working closely with your IT staff, because they're going to be the advocate for your IT departments to say, well, our developers are probably going to need this, or, you know, how are we going to support this application if we don't have this stated in the RFO or RFP or whatever. So it is important that your ERAC is embedded in that process throughout from beginning to end. They can add a lot of value. So when we talk about scoring those packets, there's basically 2 scores that I give to each component and then the whole packet together. So the biggest one, is it complete? Is there any missing documentation? I mean, missing ACRs for products. If we determine that there's a service component, did they submit their VADSR? And then we require the PDAA self-assessment on any EIR procurement, regardless of product or service. That is a required document. So have they submitted that? Did they complete it? So that'll be one of the scores, is around completeness. The other score is around credibility. So what I do is I go through and I review the ACRs, and I look at how they met success criteria on the WCAG. I look at, you know, did they turn in, you know, all of their ACRs? DIR only reviews a sample of them, but we want to make sure that they have turned in ACRs for all of their products. Again, if there's a service, did they turn in the VADSR? I review the VADSR and see, you know, how well does this vendor understand development for accessibility? You know, there's some very specific questions in there. Is there an action plan in case their product has issues? What alternative methods are they going to provide if some component of their application or the website is not accessible? How do we get in touch with them if we need an accommodation? So these are the questions that we ask, and we ask them to give us feedback, like what policies and practices do they have in place? So all ACR documentation is aligned with Section 508 standards. It must meet those industry standards that we talked about. It must meet those different standards and success criteria. And again, the VADSR is around the services. I believe that was a document that was designed by my predecessor at DIR. And I understand from the ERAC community, a lot of them are not using that document. So that might be a discussion I'll continue to have with them to see how much value that document does give to the agencies. And then the PDAA, they do review that as well. And that's a self-assessment of where the organization is at in their accessibility adoption. Do they have policies in place? What kind of practices are they using? You know, what does their development life cycle look like internally? Are they training their employees on accessibility? Do they have corrective action plans? We asked for some, you know, different scoring criteria on there. And then on the VADSR, we also ask for references, like, you know, show me some websites you've designed, give me some links to other websites. I do also look at the vendor's website. So I'll go to their homepage of their website and I do a cursory accessibility test on that, just that homepage. And if there's a lot of errors on their homepage and what they've submitted says, oh, we're very accessible, we're very matured, adoption, and we have all these policies in place and everything, but their homepage of their website has a lot of errors, there's a disconnect there. So, we kind of try to look at everything we can to make a determination of how credible is that EIR packet. And so the 2 scores they'll get is 1 for completeness, is it a pass fail? And then are they minimally credible? Are they very credible, partially credible, whatever. And that's what I'll turn into our procurement department. I'm trying to find my cursor. Here we go. So I kind of already talked about these. I'll just go through this section very quickly. So the PDAA I mentioned, it's a policy-driven adoption for accessibility. It's a spreadsheet. It's a self-assessment that the organization will complete. It has scores of 1 to 3 for the different criteria, different sections. And then there's a calculation at the bottom that gives back a score. And so depending on where they score on that, will kind of determine where they're at on their maturity journey with regard to accessibility. This is not a document that's attached to a product or a service. So it's not it has any kind of affiliation with the ACRs or the VATSR. This is a separate document that is required on all EIR procurements. Okay, the accessibility conformance report, again, this is a completed VPAT, the VPAT being the template that's provided with all of the different WCAG standards and success criteria. And, the vendor's gone through and done their testing and they can provide on there how they conform to the success criteria. Once they've completed that VPAT, it's an accessibility conformance report, and that's what we want to see. And we want to see one for every single product. We do review those to basically see how accessible is that product, how credible is that report, what does their testing look like, how do they conform. We don't fail on the ACRs, but it is important to look at them. It is also something that the agencies definitely look at. Your procurement teams and your ERACs are definitely pulling those ACR reports, and they have the right to go back and ask the vendor for a new ACR. So if DIR's review is a snapshot in time, it's at that moment, that day that they turned in that ACR for that version of the product. Depending on when your agency actually procures off of that master contract, the product could have changed. It could have a new version, which means a new ACR. And so agencies are permitted intact to go back to the vendor and say, I need the ACR again. And they can do that. So I think we talked about everything else on that slide. Again, the VATSR is for non-product offerings. So this is any kind of development services or customization, web building, the design and development of a website. This will all be, the VATSR will all be part of that. And so all together, these 3 documents make up the accessibility packet. And like I said, once I review each of them individually, then I provide a final score that I send over to our procurement division. And it's part of the pass-fail criteria in the procurement. And again, we want to make sure that ACRs are turned in for products, that if there's a service component, a VATSR has been provided, and that any EIR procurement has a PDAA attached. So this is an example because I've had vendors I've had vendors come to me, especially resellers or other vendors will say, well, I don't do products, or, I don't do this, so I don't need to turn this in. I don't need to complete this document. So here's an example where you'll have all of those documents on a procurement. So let's say you're getting a new website. You're going to have whatever content management system you decide for your website. If it's Drupal, if it's WordPress, that's going to require an ACR because that is a product. It's a commercial product, and it needs to conform to standards. It should have been tested to see how it conforms to those standards, and the manufacturer should have completed the VPAT and be able to provide you with an ACR for that product. Then you hire a company to come in who specializes in Drupal, let's say, and they come in and they actually do the design and development of your site in that product. That will require a VATSR. So they will need to complete that VATSR and, again, what are their policies and practices in place? What does their product development life cycle look like? What kind of corrective action plans do they have? What alternative methods do they have if something doesn't work? How do you contact them? And then samples of other websites that they've developed. So these are the things that we ask for the services side of a procurement. So this is an example of requiring everything, basically. Websites, you're going to have all of it, including the self-assessment as well. Okay, so digital accessibility and project management. I just have one slide for this. This is on my list of initiatives within, DIR, is to start, I like using us as a test case because we are also an agency. And so I'd like to start bringing this into more project management discussions. So if you're doing an IT project, whether you're doing some sort of implementation, SaaS implementation, or you're going to do some kind of custom development, or you're doing a new website, whatever the case may be, having this discussion early on in the project, asking those questions. Let's talk about accessibility. What are the needs? What specific requirements do we have? And then as you go through planning your project, making sure that you have those, QA and user tests kind of built into the different iterations as you move through the project, checking to make sure that, we're fixing whatever issues are coming up as a result of our testing. And then on the back end of the project, that final testing with an independent party to make sure that the site does fall within a certain limit of compliance with standards. I mean, again, we're not going to have everything's not going to be perfect, but how close we can get to that is what we're shooting for. One more thing I'll say about projects, including digital accessibility into your project planning and into your different iterations as you move through the project will and should save you money overall with your project. If you build this into the life cycle, it will help you build a better timeline for your project, a more accurate timeline. It'll help you with managing your budget for the project and your resources to allow for testing and review and all of that. If you do not build it in, let's just say it's kind of, we know it on the front end with the procurement, and then we're going to test for it on the back end before we go live. What could happen is you could have a lot of remediation issues that now push out your go live date. So now you're adding time onto your project. You need those resources longer. So now you may have resources bunching up on projects. And then you may have additional costs for testing, additional costs for remediation. So not incorporating this from the beginning and having it throughout the project could actually end up costing you more with regard to time, resource availability, and actual budget. So it's important to include this. Digital accessibility maturity. So I'm going to just kind of go through this little model. So an immature program will have no documentation in place, no real policies, no real defined practices. Maybe there's no training on staff, or staff is very minimally trained. That would be the very basic level of maturity within an organization. As you start to solidify those processes and then start documenting those processes, actually practicing your policies or your methodologies that you've created, and demonstrating consistency in practicing those processes, going back and reviewing those processes and updating them as needed, ensuring that different departments and divisions within your organization are adopting these policies and practices, making sure your staff is trained, doing periodic reviews. This will get you up to an optimized, mature level within an organization. So it's starting off with basically, very early stage or nothing at all, and then moving up that food chain of, let's start drafting some policies. Let's actually formalize them, write them down, approve them with the organization, have leadership adopt them and approve them, have the agency then adopt them. And then, what kind of monitoring do we have in place? What kind of reviews are we doing? Is it annual? Is it every 2 years that we go back in and we make some changes, we update? Are our processes documented in a way that they're auditable? If we have an outside body come in and start looking at, how we're doing our development or what our internal policies are with regard to hiring, and how do we post our jobs, you name it, whatever the case may be, whatever you've said you're going to do and written down what you're going to do, make sure that you're actually following it so that when an auditor comes in and they go through and connect all of those different resources together, they can say, yes, this, they're doing everything that they're saying they're doing and they're doing it well. So that's how you get to an optimized level for adopting digital accessibility within your organization. So I feel like I've gone through everything really fast. So some takeaways from what I've presented today: digital accessibility means equal access to information using technology. Digital accessibility adoption involves stakeholders across the organization, benefiting both the organization and its customers. So again, it's that adoption from leadership all the way down into the different divisions across the agency, not just your IT department, but how is your HR, what policies do they have in place, anything with your facilities group, all the rest of your organization, are they drafting reports and creating graphics and presentations that are accessible if someone needs to review it who may have a disability. So you want to just adopt this in throughout the organization, and then you're benefiting your customers. And customers are loyal. The disability community is very loyal to companies that demonstrate a true commitment to digital accessibility. So it is really important for, whether you're for profit or not for profit, whatever your mission is, this helps you build that customer base and that loyalty towards your mission. So the state of Texas has established rules for EIR accessibility compliance, which includes websites, technology applications, hardware, technology services, and all of the TAC and statutes in Texas do go back and align with federal law. It's not going to be an exact alignment. There are some exceptions or some exclusions in there, but for the most part, we do align with the federal law. Vetting accessible EIR procurements involves evaluating the specific documentation based on compliance with industry standards. So specific documentation, again, is it a product? Is it a service? Is it both? Are they providing complete documentation for either or both? And when you look at the ACR, how are they conforming to those different success criteria? For example, if you know that most of your audience is going to be using a screen reader, you want to make sure that the different features within that product conform with screen reader technology. Including digital accessibility, compliance, and QA throughout the project management lifecycle should reduce compliance risk, should also reduce extensions onto the project for time, possible scope extensions, possible budget extensions. So it's really important to have that woven into your project plan. And then digital accessibility maturity requires cultural adoption and documented, repeatable, and auditable processes that are consistently applied. So again, having it go across the organization from the top down and making sure that, you have everything documented, that you're monitoring it, and that it's something that when reviewed, it can go back and say, yes, this organization is, they have a good methodology, they're following it, and they're reviewing it periodically. I also have some links in here. So I have some digital accessibility legal resources in here for you. I have those industry standards. So if you want to go look at the most current version of the VPAT, if you want to look at those WCAG guidelines, I've got links in here for that. The DIR website has a lot of resources for our customers and for our vendors. We have a whole EIR accessibility section on the website with multiple pages. So I've provided you some links here, and I am a resource. So I have the EREX contact me anytime, phone, email, whatever the case may be. I am available to the IRMs as well. if you have any questions, any doubts whatsoever, you know, I get all of the questions. You know, does this functional performance criteria match what I'm looking for? Or, you know, am I using the right template? Or, you know, how would you handle this situation? They're saying they're not accessible or they're minimally accessible. What do I do? How do I fill out the exception? You know, the whole process. So I am here as a resource to all of you, and you're free to contact me with any questions related to accessibility. Trying to find my buttons here. I've also included some cases in Texas. So these are lawsuits that have happened against public entities. I have not seen any against the state of Texas yet. And the state of Texas, you can't really sue them. They have sovereign immunity. But it is important to look at what's happening to other public entities. So how are governments being impacted by legal actions with regard to digital accessibility? And this is my contact information. So that is my email address, marie.cohan@dir.texas.gov. I can also be reached at statewide-accessibility@dir.texas.gov. And so, Mark, do we have any questions?
We do. From our question and answer pane, I'll just run through a few of these. Just to confirm, if it's fields for a fillable PDF, we should specify the formats for date/time along with the tool tip.
Yes. So I'm hearing myself. Let me mute it. Can you? Okay. So yes. So just what I say is put yourself in the position of take on the persona of a person who has a sight impairment or is completely blind. What needs to happen in that particular data entry field so that the screen reader can properly communicate that to me, the user. So the tooltip may or may not be read by the screen reader, but the field definitely will be. So if you have a field, a data entry field, and it's labeled for everyone else, we can see that that's where my name goes. It also needs to have an embedded label as well that will get picked up by the screen reader.
And Eric Cortez asks, site improved checks for compliance up to WCAG 2.1, correct? Will they be updating it soon?
Okay, so site improve, yes, they're planning on testing up to 2.2 by the end of the year. So they are actually working on updating for WCAG 2.2. It will not be available until probably December, maybe the beginning of 2023.
Phyllis had a question about WCAG also. Are you able to see this one? It's a little bit longer.
Yeah, can I scroll? There we go. The question is, what is your opinion on the World Wide Web Consortium? It's noted as W3C, but it is the World Wide Web Consortium, making changes to standards from WCAG 2.0 to 2.1, to also talking about 2.2, 2.3 in regard to vendors who are just getting used to providing ACRs, and typically their VPATs at best are 2.1. That's the VPAT version. Just thinking about the advanced iterations of WCAG standards when many vendors are not providing at any level. So, like I said, we're currently at VPAT version 2.4. Our minimum standard on our procurements is 2.3. I do understand from the ERAC community that there are vendors who only have 1.0 for their ACR. So it is written in the TAC that, and I can't remember the exact date, I think it's April 2020, I think is the cutoff. If your product has not gone through any kind of change where the user interface is impacted, you do not have to do a new ACR. So we have vendors that are still on the old version, their ACRs are old, but they're also saying my product has not been updated in the last 3 or 4 years. And so we can accept that if they have not updated their product. Personally, I have a hard time understanding how a product cannot go through some sort of update in 3 years with any kind of code change that could impact the user interface, especially when, we're talking about like security updates. There's going to be maybe some code changes there, so that would require a new ACR. But if they have not changed their product and they're still using an old VPAT, we can accept those. And in those cases, you probably are going to have to do an exception as well, because their accessibility may be lower. So how they meet WCAG, whatever version of WCAG, they're probably going to have a lower success conformance to those different standards. So you may have to do an exception for those. I feel like there's another part of this question I didn't answer. So as far as WCAG versioning, my understanding is 2.1, the only difference between 2.0 and 2.1 are updates for mobile devices, so portable technology. 2.2 will have a lot more updates around website compliance. So that is what I'm hearing. And then I could not speak about 2.3 success criteria or standards yet. So I have not looked at that. But as far as the different versions of WCAG, 2.0 is our baseline, AA. There's A, AA, and AAA. We are at AA. 2.1 changes, a lot of that is for mobile device technology. And then 2.2 will focus a lot more, I think, on websites. Let's see. Luke. So Luke is asking, if I understand correctly, that means anything we purchase under a DIR contract should already have ACRs, PDAAs, and or vouchers submitted. Are we as the agencies and IHEs able to access documents that were submitted to DIR, or do we still need to ask the vendors for them directly? So you are able to submit a request to DIR and ask for those documents. We keep the procurement packets on file for a number of years. Again, keep in mind though, on the ACRs, we're getting them at a snapshot in time, depending how far, 6 months, a year down the road that you're procuring off of that contract, could even be a couple of years. You may want to check with the vendor directly and make sure you do have the most current version of their ACR. So you are entitled to do that. With regard to the PDAA, I have a project in place right now. I'm working with our internal procurement division to change our internal practices and require the PDAA up front as part of our vendor onboarding process, and have the vendors update those once a year and have those on our website under the vendor detail page. So that would be my ideal world. And I'm trying to get there. That's my big nice to have to help our customers. But in the meantime, if you want to get a copy of that PDAA, you can just contact DIR, or you can contact me and I will help you get those documents. Let's scroll back up here. So Todd Moon, thank you very much. Trying to keep bouncing. Okay, can you please expand on your statement stating agencies can require WCAG 2.1 versus 2.0 and how that relates to 508 ADA only referring to 2.0? So I have it directly from the GSA. I attended their quarterly meeting 2 weeks ago, and I specifically asked this question of them because they were asked by everyone about 2.2. And I specifically asked, well, what happens if the state has adopted, for example, state of Texas has adopted the same as what the federal government accepts? Do we stay at that level? How do we move up to different WCAG versions? And they said we can, as a state, decide to require a newer version. However, we have not changed our rules. And so once, we need to go through the rule review process and actually decide that we are going to adopt a newer version. It needs to be updated in the TAC. But, the baseline is 2.0 AA. If an agency for their purposes says, we want to adopt 2.2, you are allowed to do that based on what the GSA feedback is. You may not be able to test it. As far as websites go, Site Improve hasn't adopted it until the end of this year, maybe beginning of next year. You may have vendors, keep in mind, that are not there yet because they're still focused on 2.0, but there is that flexibility. Let's see. I don't know when the GSA is going to adopt 2.2, by the way. They did not give a deadline. It's still in draft stage. Although DIR doesn't have an approved vendor list, is there a way to notify DIR vendors who, A, have VPATs that are inaccurate, and B, refuse to remediate accessibility defects after procurement, even if stated as supported in the VPAT? So first question, VPATs that are inaccurate. So there really is no right or wrong VPAT. It's all about how you test to standards and success criteria. There are going to be vendors and products that test below what you need or below what's required for compliance. If it is a product, and this comes up a lot, especially in higher ed, where they have to adopt a technology that is not fully compliant or not compliant, because it's a niche product that they require, or it's some sort of subscription service, there's no other option out there, or the cost of remediating that particular product would just be too high. They can do an exception for that product. You can also ask your vendors to submit an accessibility statement, and I can send out what the different components of that are. You should be able to Google it as well. But basically, it's something that the vendor provides that says, we understand our product has fallen short of compliance for accessibility. We are working towards compliance by X date. If you need alternate accommodations, this is how you get them, who you contact, and we are not compliant with specific standards, and they have to list that out. So that is an option to require that as well if you want to have that kind of extra protection. And then I also get the question a lot, well, what if my product I'm using is never going to be accessible, or we're going to be using it for 5 years and we don't foresee it becoming accessible? Can we have that exception just ride for 5 years? My response is no, I don't think so. So we don't have it really written anywhere, but my recommendation, which is, one of the roles I have is, what is best practice? My recommendation to the agencies has been at least every 2 years, you go back and re-review and do a new exception for that product. So it needs those exceptions need to go through some sort of internal review that, annually or every 2 years, and go ahead and update them and have a current one on file. The worst thing we want to do is not pay attention. So when we don't pay attention, when we don't update, when we don't make changes is when we get into trouble. That's where the risk is. So as long as you're paying attention and monitoring and updating and doing, those reasonable checks along the way, your risk level should go down as for, some kind of action taken against your agency. Refusal to remediate accessibility defects. So I have not heard this one. I've heard of organizations that refuse to make their product accessible, period. I have not, if I'm understanding the question correctly, if there's an error found or some kind of issue that comes up after the fact and the vendor won't repair it. I don't know on that one. I mean, I think all procurements, the agency has the option to terminate a contract with a vendor for whatever reason, but I would just say, just try to work with your vendor to see if you can get them to fix those defects. If they can't fix them, then I would hold them accountable to what alternate means are they going to provide for your customers and your employees to kind of like accommodate whatever that defect is. Okay, third question, any thoughts on sharing internal agency non-functional requirements? NFRs for development with vendors during custom development versus just advising vendors to meet WCAG and submit a VATSR. So I would say whatever your requirements are as an agency, and this sounds like a development project. So whatever your requirements are on your development project, I would try to have those clearly outlined in the RFX. I would also revisit them during the negotiation stage. When you're shortlisting your vendors or working with one specific vendor, make sure that they understand what those accessibility requirements are, or whatever your requirements are as an agency. And then have it built into your project plan and have, QA set up for that with your developers, and then have user testing along the way, and then, a final testing on the end. That's my guidance, is just to make sure it's woven in and very clearly stated throughout the process, from the time of, drafting the procurement to actually working with the vendor. Any thoughts on sharing agency accessibility test results with vendors to assist in remediation? So I don't know if this is asking, I'm not sure if the person, I don't know if they want to come off mute, or maybe I can follow up with this person afterwards. I'm not sure if they're asking for like another agency to provide their test scripts or test results from a specific product. Haven't had that one yet before. We could talk about that. That might be a good coffee chat discussion with the ERACs. I do want to have one about testing. Maybe we just talk about, like, what do your test scripts look like? What should they look like? What should you test for? And we can talk about maybe, is there a way to share those results, if I'm understanding the question correctly. If I'm not, follow up with me. Any thoughts on WCAG 3.0 scoring? No, I do not. I do not feel comfortable speaking about WCAG 3.0 right now. So let's see, can you expand on Texas's sovereign immunity, please? So I don't know what the specific law states, and I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that Texas has some statute that prevents it from being sued. So basically, you have the right to sue the state of Texas, but it's not really going to go anywhere. They have some sort of protection in place that they can't really have a judgment against them. Aside from that, public perception is very powerful. So if you have some sort of action taken against you and it gets into the public, which then could end up in front of a legislator, that can be very powerful. It may not result in some sort of judgment against the state of Texas, but I'm sure it will result in some sort of settlement, because we don't want to have those poor or negative perceptions out there that we're not supporting a specific demographic within, our customers or employees. You mentioned the PDAA being required. Does that mean it is required for DIR or for everyone? So DIR requires it, and we do get it on with it is part of the procurement packet. Our customers are welcome to request that from DIR. The TAC doesn't specifically call out the PDAA. It calls out, whatever supporting documentation is needed. And, typically we focus on the ACRs. I think you could request, I don't see anything that says you can't request the vendor to submit a self-assessment to you all, but we are already asking for it. And so that is something you can just contact DIR and we'll go ahead and share that with you. Next question, would VADSRs be used for maintenance contracts or service agreements versus ACR? Can you discuss further? This has come up in the past. So for service agreements and maintenance, I'm guessing I'm trying to understand if there's going to be any kind of change to the product or the application that would impact the user interface. So if you're making a change and the user interface is impacted, so how the technology or the website interacts with me, the blind person again, if you think there's going to be a change that impacts that part of the application so that I might be affected, I would say definitely either have a VADSR completed or have that conversation with your vendor and document it. As far as just regular maintenance, like that's behind the scenes, that it's not impacting the user interface, I don't know that you would actually need to require one. I hope that answers your question. Are there any other questions? These are great questions, by the way. I'm going to try, hopefully we can kind of print them out. I want to actually document them and go back and fill in what I told you guys so that we can have those for those who couldn't attend today.
Marie, thank you so much for presenting. I think it's really great information, and we had a ton of audience engagement and questions there. To everyone that's still on the call, you'll receive a follow-up email from me with some slides and additional information. And thank you guys for joining. And Marie, if you don't have anything else, we can close.
I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be here today, and I hope this was a helpful topic.
Thanks again.